Bound by old secrets. Evelyn Carter had spent her life chasing outlaws, not falling for them. But when Colt Landry, the man she once loved and lost, was dragged into her jail cell, she knew the past wasn't done with her yet. He leaned against the bars, his voice smooth as whiskey. "Didn't think you'd ever see me again, did you, Sheriff?" he murmured. "Bet you didn't think about me half as much as I thought about you." Chapter 1. The Ghost in the Jail Cell. The iron door clanged shut, the sound echoing through the otherwise silent sheriff's office, a stark counterpoint to the gentle hum of the late afternoon. Evelyn Carter stood there, the weight of her badge feeling heavier than usual, the glint of the setting sun catching the worn star pin to her chest. 58 years she'd lived, and most of them had been spent upholding the law in this dusty, unforgiving corner of Arizona. She'd seen men break, towns burn, and hope wither like a desert flower under the scorching sun. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared her for the sight of him standing there, in her jail cell, as if he'd stepped out of a dream or a nightmare. Colt Landry. The name itself tasted like aged whiskey and forgotten promises on her tongue. He hadn't changed much, not in the ways that mattered. The years had etched lines around his eyes, those piercing blue eyes that could see straight through to her soul, but they hadn't dulled their intensity. His hair, once the color of sun-bleached wheat, was now streaked with silver, but it still fell across his forehead in that same carelessly charming way. He was leaner, perhaps, the muscles beneath his worn denim shirt honed by a life lived on the edge. A life, she knew, that had taken him far, far away from her. He leaned against the bars, a smirk playing on his lips, the ghost of the boy she'd once loved flickering in the depths of the man he'd become. "Didn't think you'd ever see me again, did you, Sheriff?" he murmured, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine, a shiver that had nothing to do with the chill settling in with the evening. "Bet you didn't think about me half as much as I thought about you." Evelyn swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Colt," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, considering the tempest raging inside her. "What are you doing here?" It was a stupid question, she knew. He was in her jail cell. The answer was obvious. But she needed to hear him say it, needed to hear the explanation, however improbable, that would justify his presence, his capture. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Now, Evie, is that any way to greet an old friend?" He pushed himself off the bars, taking a step closer. Even with the iron separating them, she felt the heat of his presence, the magnetic pull that had always existed between them, a force as undeniable as the desert wind. "You're no friend of mine, Landry," she retorted, her hand instinctively moving to the Colt peacemaker at her hip. It was a familiar weight, a comforting presence in a world that had offered little comfort over the years. "You're a wanted man." "Wanted for what, exactly?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. There was a challenge in his gaze, a dare. He was testing her, she knew, pushing her buttons, just like he always had. Evelyn straightened her shoulders, drawing on the strength that had seen her through countless confrontations, countless heartbreaks. Bank robbery, assault, aiding and abetting known criminals. The list was long, a testament to the path he'd chosen, the path that had led him away from her, from the life they'd once dreamed of together. He didn't deny it. He didn't flinch. He simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the creak of the old building settling around them and the distant howl of a coyote. The air was thick with the scent of dust, old wood, and the faint, lingering aroma of Colt leather, gunpowder, and something indefinably him. It was a scent that had haunted her dreams for years, a phantom reminder of what she'd lost. "They said you were dead," she finally said, the words a whisper in the growing darkness. The rumor had reached her years ago, carried on the wind like a tumbleweed, a bitter seed of grief that had taken root in her heart. She'd mourned him, in her own way, in the quiet solitude of her small ranch house, under the vast, indifferent expanse of the Arizona sky. Colt's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of something that might have been regret. Rumors are like desert mirages, Evie. They shimmer with promise, but they're rarely real. And you are? She asked, her voice barely audible. Real, I mean? He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold iron bars. As real as the ache in your heart, Sheriff, he said softly. As real as the memories that keep you up at night. She flinched, turning away from his gaze, unable to bear the weight of his knowing. He knew her too well, still. He saw the cracks in her armor, the vulnerabilities she'd spent years trying to conceal. He saw the woman she'd been, the woman she'd tried to forget. Why, Colt? She whispered, turning back to face him. Why did you come back? He held her gaze, his eyes dark and intense. Because, he said, his voice raw with a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to hear, some things are worth facing, even if it means facing a lifetime of regret. Some things some people are worth coming back for. The floorboards creaked behind her. Deputy Miller, young, eager, and blessedly oblivious to the history etched between her and the man in the cell, cleared his throat. Sheriff, he said, the circuit judge is here. He wants to see you about the prisoner. Evelyn nodded, her gaze still locked with Colt's. The judge. The law. The inevitable. It was all closing in, a suffocating tide of duty and consequence. But for a moment, just a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to remember the girl she'd been, the girl who'd believed in happy endings, the girl who'd loved Colt Landry with all her heart. And in that moment, she knew that the past wasn't done with her. It had just walked back into her life, locked in a jail cell, and was staring at her with eyes that held the promise of both redemption and ruin. What did she choose? Chapter 2. Shadows of Yesterday's Promises. The judge, a stern-faced man named Silas Blackwood, smelled of stale tobacco and self-importance. He barely glanced at Colt, dismissing him with a curt nod as if he were just another stray dog brought in from the desert. His attention, sharp and judgmental, was fixed solely on Evelyn. Sheriff Carter, he began, his voice raspy from years of shouting in courtrooms, this is a delicate situation. Landry is wanted in 3 counties. The charges are serious. Evelyn met his gaze evenly. I'm aware of the charges, Judge. She'd read the wanted posters herself, each one a fresh stab of betrayal, a reminder of the chasm that had grown between her present and the shared past she and Colt once inhabited. He's been a thorn in the side of law-abiding citizens for years, Blackwood continued, adjusting his spectacles. I'm a mess. He needs to be made an example of. He will be dealt with according to the law, Evelyn replied, her voice firm despite the tremor in her heart. She wouldn't let Blackwood, or anyone else, see the turmoil raging beneath her stoic exterior. She was the law in this town, and she would uphold it, even if it meant condemning the man she'd once loved. Blackwood tapped a long, bony finger on his desk. There's talk, Sheriff. Rumors. About your past association with the prisoner. Evelyn felt a flush creep up her neck. The small town of Redemption, Arizona, was a place where secrets were hard to keep, where whispers traveled faster than the desert wind. She'd known this moment would come. The moment when her past would collide with her present, threatening to shatter the carefully constructed life she'd built. Colt Landry and I were acquainted, years ago, she admitted, choosing her words carefully. Before he chose his current path. Acquainted? Blackwood raised a skeptical eyebrow. Some say it was more than that. Some say you were involved. Evelyn's jaw tightened. My personal history is irrelevant, Judge. I apprehended Landry. I brought him in. That's all that matters. Blackwood leaned back in his chair, studying her with an unnerving intensity. Perhaps, he said slowly, but appearances matter, Sheriff. Especially in a town like this. Justice must not only be done, it must be seen to be done. And if there's even a hint of favoritism, he let the threat hang in the air, unspoken but palpable. Evelyn knew what he was implying. If she showed any leniency towards Colt, her career, her reputation, everything she'd worked for, would be destroyed. She'd be branded and exiled, another ghost haunting the forgotten corners of the frontier. I assure you, Judge, she said, her voice steady despite the knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "There will be no favoritism. Colt Landry will be treated like any other prisoner." Blackwood nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Good. See that he is. The trial will be held here, in Redemption, in 2 weeks' time. I expect you to keep him secure. He's a slippery one, that Landry." "He won't escape," Evelyn said, her gaze flickering towards the jail cell, where Colt stood silently watching them, his expression unreadable. After the judge left, Evelyn stood alone in her office, the silence pressing in on her. The weight of her decision, the weight of her past, felt almost unbearable. She walked over to the window, gazing out at the dusty main street, where the shadows were lengthening, turning the familiar landscape into a tapestry of secrets and regrets. She remembered the day she'd first met Colt. She'd been 16, fresh-faced and full of dreams, working on her father's ranch. Colt had been a hired hand, a drifter passing through, but he'd stayed longer than most. He'd had a way about him, a charm that had been impossible to resist. He'd taught her how to shoot, how to ride like the wind, how to laugh in the face of danger. He'd also taught her how to love. They'd made plans, whispered promises under the vast, star-studded sky. They'd dreamed of building a life together, a ranch of their own, a family. But those dreams had shattered like glass, scattered by the harsh realities of the frontier, by Colt's restless spirit, by the choices he'd made. She still carried the small, silver locket he had given her. She hadn't opened in years, afraid of the bittersweet memories locked within. She turned back to the jail cell. Colt was sitting on the cot, his head in his hands. He looked defeated. And for the first time since he'd been brought in, Evelyn felt a pang of something other than anger and betrayal. She felt pity. And something more, something she didn't dare name. She walked over to the cell, her boots echoing on the wooden floor. "Colt," she said softly. He looked up, his eyes filled with a weariness that mirrored her own. "Evie," he said, his voice hoarse. "Why did you really come back?" She asked again, the question that had been burning in her heart since she'd first seen him. He hesitated, then sighed. "I told you. Some things are worth facing." "But why now?" she pressed. "After all these years?" He stood up, walking over to the bars, his gaze holding hers. "Because I heard you were in trouble," he said quietly. "Because I heard there were bad men, who were threatening you, threatening your town." Evelyn frowned. "What are you talking about?" He leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "There's a storm coming, Evie. A storm you don't even know about. And I came back to help you weather it." His words sent a chill down her spine, a premonition of danger that was far more immediate than the threat of a trial. She didn't know what he was talking about, but she knew one thing. Colt Landry, for all his flaws, for all the pain he'd caused her, had never lied to her. And that meant she was in more trouble than she'd ever imagined. The shadows, it seemed, had more secrets yet to reveal. Chapter 3. Dust and the Weight of Regret. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the desert air holding a deceptive serenity. Evelyn had barely slept, Colt's words echoing in her mind, a discordant symphony of fear and reluctant, reawakening hope. A storm coming, a storm you don't even know about. What had he meant? She found him already awake, sitting on the edge of the cot, staring out the small, barred window at the rising sun. He looked up as she approached, a faint smile touching his lips. "Morning, Sheriff," he said, his voice still carrying that low, resonant quality that sent shivers down her spine, shivers she tried to ignore. "Coffee?" she offered, holding up a tin mug. It was a peace offering, of sorts, a small gesture of normalcy in a situation that was anything but normal. He nodded, taking the mug from her. Their fingers brushed, and a jolt of electricity, unexpected and unwelcome, shot up her arm. She quickly pulled away, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He took a sip, his eyes meeting hers over the rim of the mug. "Strong," he commented. "Just the way I remember you liking it." Evelyn busied herself with pouring a cup for herself, avoiding his gaze. "Things change, Colt," she said, her voice tight. "People change. Do they?" he asked, his voice soft, almost challenging. He set the mug down on the small, rickety table that served as the cell's only other furniture. Or do they just bury the parts of themselves they don't want to face? She turned to face him, her own cup held tightly in her hands. You should know all about that, shouldn't you? She retorted, her voice laced with bitterness. He didn't flinch. I do, he admitted. But I'm not the only one, Evie. The truth of his words stung. She had buried parts of herself, the parts that had loved him, the parts that had dreamed of a different life. She'd buried them deep, under layers of duty, responsibility, and the hard-won pragmatism of a woman who'd learned to survive in a man's world. Tell me what you meant, she said, changing the subject, unwilling to delve any deeper into the treacherous territory of their shared past. About the storm. Colt hesitated, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing, probing. There's a man named Silas Thorne, he began, his voice low and serious. He's a cattle baron, ruthless and ambitious. He wants this land, this town. And he's not afraid to use force to get it. Evelyn frowned. She'd heard of Thorne, of course. He was a powerful figure in the territory, a man known for his ruthlessness and his vast holdings. But she'd never had any direct dealings with him. What does he want with redemption? She asked. We're just a small town, barely scraping by. It's not the town he wants, Colt explained. It's the water. There's an aquifer under this land, a vast underground lake. Enough water to irrigate thousands of acres, to make a man a king. Evelyn's eyes widened. She'd always known there was water beneath their land, but she'd never realized the extent of it. If Thorne controlled the water, he controlled everything. He could starve out the ranchers, drive them off their land, and claim it all for himself. And you think he's coming here? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I know he is, Colt said. He's already sent his men ahead, scouts, to assess the situation, to prepare the way. His men? Here? In redemption? Evelyn felt a surge of anger, of protectiveness towards the town she'd sworn to defend. Colt nodded. They're disguised, of course. Blending in. But they're here. Watching. Waiting. Evelyn's mind raced. She thought of the strangers who'd drifted into town in recent weeks, the unfamiliar faces in the saloon, the men who seemed to be watching her, assessing her. She dismissed them as drifters, transients, the usual flotsam and jetsam of the frontier. But now how do you know all this? She asked, her suspicion returning. Colt met her gaze unflinchingly. I used to ride with some of Thorne's men, he admitted. Before, I made some different choices. It was a carefully worded admission, a hint of the life he'd led, the life he'd supposedly left behind. Evelyn didn't know whether to believe him, whether to trust him. But she couldn't deny the fear that was coiling in her gut, the sense of impending doom that his words had conjured. What do we do? She asked, the question a plea, a surrender to the reality that she needed his help, whether she liked it or not. He stood up, walking over to the bars, his eyes searching hers. We fight, he said, his voice low and determined. We fight for what's ours. We fight for redemption. And as she looked into his eyes, into the depths of the man he'd become, she saw not the outlaw, not the ghost of her past, but a glimmer of the man she'd once loved, the man who'd always been willing to fight for what he believed in. And she knew, with a certainty that shook her to her core, that she would fight alongside him, even if it meant risking everything. The dust of the past was swirling, stirred up by the winds of change, and the weight of regret was heavy, but beneath it all, a spark of hope, fragile but persistent, had begun to flicker. Where that flicker of hope would lead was the true weight of this new, unexpected day. Chapter 4. The unforgiving glare of truth. The day passed in a blur of activity. Evelyn, fueled by a mixture of adrenaline and dread, threw herself into preparing the town for the threat Colt had warned her about. She deputized a handful of trustworthy men, ranchers and shopkeepers who had a stake in Redemption's survival. She sent messages to neighboring towns, requesting assistance, knowing that it was a long shot, that help might not arrive in time. She avoided Colt, avoiding the complicated tangle of emotions that his presence stirred within her. She focused on the practical, on the tangible, on the things she could control. But his words, his warning, hung over her like a shadow, a constant reminder of the danger that was lurking, unseen but ever present. As evening approached, she found herself drawn back to the jail, to the man who held the key to their survival, the man who also held the key to her past. She found him standing by the window, gazing out at the setting sun, the fiery hues painting his face in shades of gold and crimson. "We need a plan," she said, her voice brusque, businesslike. She couldn't afford to be vulnerable, not now, not when so much was at stake. He turned to face her, his eyes dark and serious. "I have one," he said, "but you're not going to like it." She raised an eyebrow, her skepticism evident. "Try me." He hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Thorne's men, the ones who are here in town, they're waiting for a signal. A signal to start the takeover." "What kind of signal?" Evelyn asked, her hand instinctively moving to the gun at her hip. "A fire," Colt said. "A large fire, something that can be seen for miles. It will be the sign for Thorne's main force to move in, to attack the town while everyone is distracted, panicked." Evelyn's mind raced. A fire, where would they start it? The most likely target was the livery stable, filled with hay, dry wood, a perfect tinderbox. Or perhaps the church, the tallest building in town, a beacon of destruction. "We need to prevent that fire," she said, her voice firm. "We need to find Thorne's men, stop them before they can act." Colt nodded. "That's the plan. But it's not that simple. We don't know who they are, how many there are, and they'll be expecting us to be looking for them. So what do we do?" Evelyn asked, frustration creeping into her voice. "We use bait," Colt said, his eyes meeting hers, a glint of something dangerous, something reckless, in their depths. "Bait?" Evelyn frowned. "What kind of bait?" "Me," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm the bait." Evelyn stared at him, speechless. "You're insane," she finally said. "You think Thorne's men will just walk up to you, reveal themselves?" "They might," Colt said. "If they think I'm still on their side. If they think I'm going to help them." "And what if they don't?" Evelyn asked, her voice laced with sarcasm. "What if they just shoot you on sight?" "Then you'll have your confirmation," he said, a shrug in his voice. "And you'll know who to target." It was a crazy plan, reckless and dangerous. It was also, she realized, the only plan they had. She hated it. She hated the fact that she was even considering it, that she was willing to put Colt's life at risk, even after everything. "No," she said firmly. "I won't allow it. It's too dangerous." Colt took a step closer, his voice softening. "Evie," he said, "there's no other way. We need to draw them out, expose them. And I'm the only one who can do it." "There has to be another way," she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. The touch was unexpected, a shock to her system. She hadn't been touched like that in years, not with tenderness, not with affection. "There isn't," he said softly. "And even if there was, I wouldn't let you face this alone. I owe you that much, Evie. I owe you more than that." His words, his touch, broke through her defenses, cracking the wall she'd built around her heart. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the regret, the love. And she knew, with a sickening certainty, that she couldn't stop him. She could and did love him. Still. "Promise me," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Promise me you'll be careful." He smiled, a sad, tender smile. "I promise," he said. "I'll be as careful as a man can be, walking into a den of wolves." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a fleeting, hesitant kiss. It was a kiss of goodbye, a kiss of desperation, a kiss of hope. And as he pulled away, Evelyn knew that she was sending him into the darkness, not knowing if he would ever return. The unforgiving glare of the truth was upon them. She was in love with an outlaw, and she was about to use him as bait to save her town. The morality of it all was a luxury she could not currently afford. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Desert Wind. The plan was set in motion with a sickening speed. Evelyn, despite her misgivings, knew that time was of the essence. Thorne's men could strike at any moment, and they needed to be ready. She reluctantly agreed to Colt's proposal, her heart heavy with a mixture of dread and a reluctant, rekindled hope. Under the cover of darkness, Evelyn released Colt from his cell. It was a risky move, one that could cost her her job, her reputation, everything. But she trusted him, at least in this. She trusted his knowledge of Thorne's methods, his ability to infiltrate their ranks, to draw them out. She gave him back his gun, a worn Colt Peacemaker that felt strangely familiar in his hand. He checked the cylinder, the movement smooth and practiced, a reminder of the life he'd led, the life she'd tried to forget. "Be careful," she said again, the words a plea, a prayer. He nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "I will," he said. "And you be ready." He slipped out of the jail, disappearing into the shadows, leaving Evelyn alone with her doubts and her fears. She watched him go, her heart aching with a sense of foreboding, a premonition of loss. She spent the rest of the night organizing her deputies, positioning them strategically around the town, focusing on the livery stable and the church, the most likely targets for Thorne's arsonists. She tried to project an air of confidence, of control, but inside, she was a maelstrom of anxiety. The whispers started early the next morning. Rumors spread through the town like wildfire, fueled by fear and uncertainty. People had seen Colt, free, walking the streets. They were questioning Evelyn's judgment, her sanity, her loyalty. She ignored them, focusing on the task at hand. She had to trust Colt, had to believe that he could pull this off, that he could save them all. But the doubts lingered, gnawing at her, whispering insidious questions in her ear. What if he betrayed her again? What if he was still working with Thorne? What if she'd made a terrible mistake? She found herself drawn to the small, dusty church, the one place in town that had always offered her solace, a sense of peace. She sat in one of the pews, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes closed, praying for guidance, for strength, for Colt's safety. She remembered the day he'd proposed to her, right here in this church, years ago. He'd been so young, so full of hope, so sure of their future. She'd said yes, without hesitation, her heart overflowing with love. But that love had been tested, broken, by the harsh realities of the frontier, by Colt's choices, by the life he'd chosen to lead. She opened her eyes, gazing up at the simple wooden cross that hung above the altar. She'd always believed in justice, in the law, in doing what was right. But now, she was questioning everything. She was breaking the law, trusting an outlaw, risking everything on a desperate gamble. Was she doing the right thing? Was she saving her town, or was she condemning it? The answers eluded her, lost in the swirling dust of uncertainty, in the whispers of doubt that echoed through the empty church. As the sun began to set, casting long, ominous shadows across the town, Evelyn felt a growing sense of unease. The air was thick with tension, with anticipation. The waiting was the hardest part, the not knowing what was going to happen when it was going to happen. She walked outside, scanning the streets, her hand resting on the butt of her gun. The town was eerily quiet, deserted. The calm before the storm. And then she saw him, Colt, walking towards her, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and something else. Something that looked like fear. "They're here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "They're ready to make their move." Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. The moment of truth. The storm had arrived. And as the first flames began to lick at the sky, she knew that the battle for redemption had begun. The whispers had become a roar. Chapter 6. A bargain struck at twilight. The fire started at the livery stable, just as Evelyn had predicted. Thick, black smoke billowed into the sky, a signal visible for miles, a beacon of chaos and destruction. The town erupted into pandemonium, people scrambling to save their belongings, their animals, their lives. Evelyn, her heart pounding, raced towards the flames, her deputies close behind. She saw Colt, amidst the chaos, his face illuminated by the firelight, his gun drawn. He was moving with a purpose, a deadly grace, weaving through the panicked crowds, searching for something or someone. She saw them then, the men Colt had warned her about. They were dressed like ordinary townsfolk, but there was something in their eyes, a coldness, a ruthlessness, that set them apart. They were moving towards the church, carrying torches, their intentions clear. "Stop them," Evelyn yelled, her voice hoarse above the roar of the flames. Her deputies engaged, gunfire echoing through the night, a deadly dance of law and outlaw. Evelyn found herself face to face with one of Thorne's men, a burly, scarred brute with a cruel smile. He lunged at her, a knife glinting in his hand. She sidestepped, drawing her own gun, firing a shot that sent him reeling back, clutching his arm. She didn't have time to celebrate her small victory. The fire was spreading rapidly, threatening to engulf the entire town. She had to stop it, had to save her people, her home. She saw Colt again, fighting his way towards the church, where the remaining arsonists were attempting to set the building ablaze. He was outnumbered, surrounded, but he fought with a ferocity, a desperation, that was both terrifying and inspiring. Evelyn joined him, firing her gun, taking down another one of Thorne's men. They fought back to back, a united front against the encroaching darkness, a strange, unlikely partnership forged in the crucible of fire and fear. "We need to get to the well," Colt yelled, his voice strained. "We can use the water to fight the fire." It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was their only hope. They fought their way towards the town square, where the old, hand-pumped well stood, a symbol of life in the arid landscape. They reached the well, exhausted, battered, but still fighting. Evelyn began to pump furiously, her arms aching, her lungs burning. Colt stood guard, his gun blazing, protecting her, protecting their last chance. The water began to flow, a trickle at first, then a steady stream. They filled buckets, soaked blankets, anything they could find, fighting the flames with a desperate, unwavering determination. As the fire began to subside, slowly, grudgingly yielding to their efforts, Evelyn saw a figure emerge from the shadows. It was Silas Thorne himself, his face contorted with rage, his eyes burning with hatred. "You can't stop me, Sheriff," he yelled, his voice hoarse. "This land is mine. The water is mine." He raised his gun, aiming at Evelyn. Colt saw him, reacted instantly, firing a shot that struck Thorne in the shoulder, sending him sprawling to the ground. The remaining arsonists, seeing their leader fall, lost their nerve, surrendering to Evelyn's deputies. The battle was over. The town was saved. But at what cost? Evelyn stood there, amidst the smoldering ruins, the acrid smell of smoke filling her lungs. She looked at Colt, his face blackened with soot, his clothes torn, his eyes filled with a weariness that mirrored her own. "It's done," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his gaze sweeping over the devastation. "For now," he said. "But he'll be back. Thorne won't give up that easily." "We'll be ready," Evelyn said, her voice firm, her resolve hardening. Thorne was being tended to by the town doctor, his wound bandaged, his anger simmering beneath the surface. He looked at Evelyn, his eyes filled with a venomous hatred. "You may have won this battle, Sheriff," he hissed, "but you haven't won the war. I'll see you in hell before I give up this land." Evelyn met his gaze unflinchingly. "Then I'll see you there, Thorne," she said. "But I won't be alone." She turned to Colt, her eyes meeting his. A silent understanding passed between them, a bargain struck at twilight, a promise of a future, uncertain but shared. They had faced the fire together, and they had emerged, scarred but not broken. The storm had passed, but the aftermath, the rebuilding, the reckoning, was just beginning. They would face it, as they faced the fire together. Chapter 7. Scars Beneath the Badge. The days following the fire were a whirlwind of activity. The townsfolk, shaken but resilient, rallied together to rebuild, to heal, to put their lives back together. Evelyn, as sheriff, was at the center of it all, organizing relief efforts, coordinating repairs, maintaining order in the face of chaos. She worked tirelessly, driven by a sense of responsibility, by a need to prove herself, to justify the trust that the town had placed in her. But beneath the surface, she was exhausted, emotionally drained, haunted by the events of that night, by the near loss of everything she held dear. Colt, despite his outlaw status, remained in redemption. He helped with the rebuilding, his skills as a carpenter and a handyman proving surprisingly useful. He worked alongside the townsfolk, earning their grudging respect, their cautious acceptance. Evelyn watched him, her feelings a tangled mess of gratitude, suspicion, and something she didn't dare acknowledge, not yet. She saw the way he interacted with people, his easy charm, his genuine concern, his willingness to help. She saw glimpses of the man she'd once loved, the man she'd thought lost forever. But she also saw the scars, the physical and emotional wounds that he carried, the reminders of the life he'd led, the choices he'd made. She saw the haunted look in his eyes, the way he flinched at sudden noises, the way he kept himself apart, even as he worked alongside others. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the newly rebuilt livery stable, she found him sitting alone, sharpening his knife, his movements slow and deliberate. She approached him cautiously, her boots crunching on the gravel. He looked up, a faint smile touching his lips. "Evening, Sheriff," he said, his voice low and raspy. "Colt," she said, her voice soft. She sat down beside him, a comfortable silence settling between them, a silence that was more intimate than words. "Thank you," she said, finally breaking the silence. "For what you did. For saving the town." He shrugged, his gaze fixed on the knife in his hands. "It was the right thing to do," he said.
"It was more than that," she insisted.
"You risked your life. You could have left, run away, but you stayed. You fought." He looked at her then, his eyes searching hers. "I told you," he said. "I had a reason to come back." She knew what he meant. He'd come back for her, to protect her, to redeem himself. But she also knew that it wasn't that simple. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many unresolved issues between them. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He sighed, sheathing his knife. "I don't know," he admitted. "I'm still a wanted man. I can't stay here forever." "You could turn yourself in," she suggested, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. It was the right thing to do, the lawful thing, but the thought of him back in a jail cell, separated from her, filled her with a dread she couldn't ignore. He shook his head. "I won't go back to prison, Evie. Not for Thorne. Not for anyone." "Then what?" she asked, her voice tinged with desperation. "What are you going to do?" He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. "I'm going to stay here," he said, "for as long as I can.
For as long as you'll have me."
His touch sent a shiver down her spine, a familiar warmth spreading through her. She leaned into his hand, her eyes closing, savoring the moment, the intimacy, the connection. "I don't know if I can trust you, Colt," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I know," he said softly, "but I'm going to prove to you that you can. I'm going to earn your trust, Evie. I'm going to earn your love." And as he held her gaze, she saw a sincerity in his eyes, a vulnerability that she hadn't seen in years. She saw the scars beneath the badge, the wounds that he carried, the pain that he'd endured. And she knew that she was falling in love with him all over again, despite the risks, despite the dangers, despite everything. The scars, she realized, were not just his. They were hers, too. And perhaps, together, they could find a way to heal. Chapter 8. The Outlaw's Code. The Sheriff's Dilemma. The uneasy truce between Evelyn and Colt settled into a routine, a delicate dance of shared responsibilities and unspoken desires. He continued to help with the rebuilding efforts, his presence a constant reminder of both the danger they had faced and the fragile hope they were clinging to. He kept a low profile, avoiding unnecessary attention, aware of his precarious position as a wanted man in the sheriff's town. Evelyn, in turn, found herself increasingly torn between her duty and her heart. She knew she should arrest him, hand him over to the authorities, uphold the law she had sworn to protect. But she couldn't bring herself to do it. She saw the good in him, the changes he was making, the effort he was putting into redeeming himself. She saw the man she had once loved, the man she was starting to love again. The townsfolk, initially wary of Colt, began to accept him, albeit grudgingly. They saw his willingness to help, his dedication to rebuilding their community. They saw the way he looked at Evelyn, the respect, the affection. They started to whisper, not with suspicion this time, but with a cautious understanding. One afternoon, while working on repairing the roof of the damaged church, Colt found himself cornered by a group of men, former associates of Silas Thorne, who had somehow learned of his presence in redemption. They were rough, dangerous men, loyal to their leader, eager to avenge his defeat. Well, one of them sneered, a cruel smile twisting his lips. Look what we have here. The traitor himself. Colt stood his ground, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his hip, a gun Evelyn had given back to him, a symbol of her trust, her conflicted feelings. I'm not looking for trouble, he said, his voice calm but firm. Trouble found you, Landry, another man said, stepping forward, his eyes filled with hatred. Thorne wants you back, dead or alive. Colt knew he was outnumbered, outgunned. He could try to fight, but the odds were stacked against him. He could run, but that would only confirm their suspicions, reinforce his image as an outlaw. He thought of Evelyn, of the life they were trying to build, of the fragile hope they were nurturing. He couldn't let these men take that away from him. He couldn't let them hurt her. I'm not going back to Thorne, he said, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. I'm done with that life. The men laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. You don't have a choice, Landry, the leader said. You made your bed, now you lie in it. They closed in, their intentions clear. Colt prepared to fight, knowing that it might be his last stand. But then, a voice rang out, sharp and commanding. That's enough. Evelyn stepped out from behind the church, her gun drawn, her deputies flanking her. She stood between Colt and Thorne's men, her stance firm, her eyes blazing with anger. These men are under arrest, she said, her voice ringing with authority. For attempted assault, for threatening a citizen of redemption. Thorne's men hesitated, surprised by her intervention, by her defense of an outlaw. They looked at each other, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. You're protecting him, Sheriff? The leader asked, incredulity lacing his voice. You're protecting a wanted man? Evelyn met his gaze unflinchingly. I'm upholding the law, she said. And in this town, I am the law. It was a tense standoff, a moment of precarious balance. The air crackled with unspoken threats, with the potential for violence. But Evelyn held her ground, her determination unwavering. Finally, Thorne's men backed down, their bravado crumbling in the face of her resolve. They were arrested, taken to the jail, the same jail Colt had occupied just days before. Colt watched her, his heart filled with a mixture of admiration and love. He saw the strength in her, the unwavering commitment to justice, even when it conflicted with her own feelings. He saw the woman he had fallen in love with, the woman he would do anything to protect. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch of her small ranch house, watching the stars emerge in the vast, darkening sky, Evelyn finally spoke about what had happened. You could have been killed, she said, her voice soft, her eyes filled with concern. He nodded, his gaze meeting hers. I know, he said. But I couldn't let them take me. Not without a fight. Why, Colt? She asked, her voice tinged with frustration. Why risk your life for this? He reached out, his hand gently touching hers. Because of you, Evie, he said. Because of what we're building here. Because I believe in us. She looked at him, her heart aching with a love she could no longer deny. She knew the risks, the dangers, the uncertainties. But she also knew that she couldn't live without him, not anymore. The outlaw's code and the sheriff's dilemma were intertwined, and she was caught in the middle, her heart pulling her in one direction, her duty in another. The resolution, she knew, would not be easy. Chapter 9. Between the Law and a Lost Love. The arrest of Thorne's men sent a ripple of unease through redemption. While the townsfolk were grateful for Evelyn's protection, they were also wary of the potential repercussions. Thorne was a powerful man, with a long reach and a vengeful nature. They knew he wouldn't let this affront go unpunished. Evelyn, too, was feeling the pressure. She received a telegram from the territorial governor, demanding an explanation for her actions, for her apparent harboring of a known outlaw. She knew she was walking a tightrope, balancing her duty to the law with her personal feelings for Colt. She tried to ignore the whispers, the questioning glances, the doubts that were being cast upon her. She focused on her work, on keeping the town safe, on preparing for Thorne's inevitable retaliation. But it was becoming increasingly difficult to separate her personal life from her professional responsibilities. Colt was everywhere, a constant presence in her life, in her heart. He, in turn, was acutely aware of the burden he was placing on her. He saw the stress in her eyes, the weariness in her movements, the way she carried herself, as if bracing for a blow. He knew he was putting her career, her reputation, everything she'd worked for, at risk. He tried to distance himself, to minimize his contact with her, to avoid causing her any further trouble. But it was like trying to stop the desert wind, an impossible task. They were drawn to each other, bound by a connection that was stronger than the law, stronger than their past mistakes, stronger than their fears. One evening, as they were sharing a quiet meal in her kitchen, the silence punctuated by the crackling of the fire in the hearth, Colt finally voiced the question that had been weighing on his mind. "Maybe I should leave, Evie," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "Maybe it would be better for you, for the town, if I just disappeared." Evelyn looked up, her eyes meeting his, a mixture of pain and defiance in their depths. "Don't you dare say that," she said, her voice firm. "Don't you dare even think it." "But I'm causing you trouble," he insisted. "I'm putting you in danger." "I can handle it," she said. "I'm the sheriff, remember? I'm supposed to handle trouble." "But this is different," he said. "This is personal. This is us." She reached across the table, her hand covering his. "And that's exactly why you can't leave," she said softly. "Because this is us. And we're in this together." Her words, her touch, sent a wave of emotion through him. He saw the love in her eyes, the unwavering belief in him, the willingness to fight for what they had. He knew he couldn't leave her, not now, not ever. "I love you, Evie," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I've always loved you." She smiled, a sad, tender smile. "I know," she said. "And I love you, Colt. I never stopped." They sat there, in the flickering firelight, their hands clasped together, their hearts connected, a silent acknowledgement of the love that had endured, the love that had brought them back together. But even in that moment of intimacy, of shared vulnerability, they knew that the challenges were far from over. They were living on borrowed time, caught between the law and a lost love, their future uncertain, their path fraught with danger. The telegram from the governor still lay on her desk, a stark reminder of the external forces that were threatening to tear them apart. She had to respond, had to justify her actions, had to find a way to protect Colt, to protect their future. She was walking a tightrope, with the law on one side and her heart on the other, and she knew that one wrong step could send them both tumbling into the abyss. The space between was narrowing, and a choice was looming, a choice that would define not only their future, but their very identities. Chapter 10. Echoes of Gunfire and Heartbreak. Evelyn's response to the governor's telegram was carefully worded, a delicate balance of truth and obfuscation. She explained the situation in redemption, the threat posed by Silas Thorne, the action she had taken to protect her town. She omitted Colt's involvement, referring to him only as an informant who had provided valuable intelligence. It was a risky gamble, a lie by omission that could easily unravel. But she felt she had no other choice. She was protecting Colt, protecting their future, even if it meant bending the rules, blurring the lines between right and wrong. The governor's reply was swift and uncompromising. He demanded that Evelyn bring Colt Landry to justice, that she prove her loyalty to the law, that she demonstrate her ability to govern redemption effectively. He threatened to send in federal marshals if she failed to comply. Evelyn felt the walls closing in. She was trapped between her duty and her heart, between the demands of the law and the dictates of her love for Colt. She knew she couldn't keep him hidden forever, that sooner or later, she would have to make a choice. She shared the governor's telegram with Colt, her heart heavy with dread. He read it silently, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of resignation and understanding. "I knew this was coming," he said, his voice low and somber. "I knew I couldn't hide forever." "What are we going to do?" Evelyn asked, her voice tinged with desperation. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek.
"We're going to face it," he said.
"Together. Just like we always have." But facing it meant confronting their past, the choices they had made, the mistakes that had led them to this point. It meant revisiting the pain, the heartbreak, the years of separation. That night, under the vast, star-studded Arizona sky, they talked. They talked for hours, sharing their memories, their regrets, their hopes for the future. Colt told her about his life on the run, the men he'd ridden with, the crimes he'd committed, the guilt he carried. "I was young," he said, his voice filled with remorse. "And stupid. I thought I was invincible, untouchable. I thought I could outrun the law, outrun my past." Evelyn listened, her heart aching for him, for the boy he'd been, for the man he'd become. She saw the pain in his eyes, the genuine desire for redemption, for a second chance. She told him about her life after he'd left, the loneliness, the emptiness, the struggle to rebuild, to find her place in a world that had seemed so bleak, so devoid of hope. "I never stopped loving you, Colt," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Even when I hated you, even when I thought you were dead, I never stopped loving you." Her words were a balm to his soul, a validation of the love that had endured, the love that had brought them back together. He held her close, his arms wrapped around her, his heart overflowing with gratitude, with hope. But even as they shared their most intimate feelings, their deepest fears, the echoes of the past lingered, a haunting reminder of the obstacles they still faced. The sound of gunfire, the memory of heartbreak, the weight of the law, it all hung over them, a dark cloud threatening to extinguish the fragile flame of their rekindled love. As the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Evelyn knew that the time for talking was over. The time for action had come. She had to make a decision, a choice that would determine their fate, their future. The echoes of the past were loud, but the promise of a future together was louder. Which would she heed? Chapter 11. The Price of Redemption's Path. Evelyn made her decision with a heavy heart, but a clear mind. She couldn't betray the law, the oath she had sworn to uphold. But she also couldn't betray Colt, the man she loved, the man who had risked his life to save her town. She had to find a way to reconcile her duty and her heart, to find a path that would lead to justice, but also to redemption. She decided to take Colt's case directly to the circuit judge, Silas Blackwood, the same man who had initially presided over his arrest. She knew it was a long shot, that Blackwood was a stickler for the law, a man unlikely to show leniency. But she had to try. She had to fight for Colt, for their future. She arranged a meeting with Blackwood in his chambers, a small, sparsely furnished room that smelled of old paper and stale tobacco. She laid out her case, explaining Colt's involvement in stopping Thorne, his willingness to cooperate, his efforts to change his life. "Judge Blackwood," she said, her voice firm and resolute, "Colt Landry is not the same man he was years ago. He's made mistakes, yes, but he's also shown remorse, a genuine desire to make amends." Blackwood listened intently, his face impassive, his eyes unreadable. He tapped a long, bony finger on his desk, a gesture that Evelyn had come to recognize as a sign of his contemplation. "Sheriff Carter," he said finally, his voice raspy, "you're asking me to overlook a long list of crimes. You're asking me to bend the law for a man who has shown nothing but contempt for it." "I'm asking you to consider the circumstances," Evelyn countered. "To consider the good he's done, the changes he's made. To consider the possibility of redemption." Blackwood leaned back in his chair, studying her with an unnerving intensity. "You're in love with him, aren't you?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. Evelyn hesitated, then nodded, her cheeks flushing. Yes, she admitted. I am. And that clouds your judgment, Blackwood said, his voice turning stern again. It makes you biased, unreliable. It also gives me insight, Evelyn retorted. It allows me to see the man behind the outlaw, the good beneath the bad. Blackwood sighed, rubbing his temples. This is a difficult situation, Sheriff. A very difficult situation. He stood up, walking over to the window, gazing out at the dusty main street. He seemed to be wrestling with his own conscience, his own sense of justice. I believe in the law, Sheriff Carter, he said finally, turning back to face her. I believe in its power, its necessity. But I also believe in mercy. In second chances. Evelyn's heart leaped with hope. Was it possible? Could Blackwood actually be considering leniency? I'm willing to make a deal, Blackwood said, his voice firm. A bargain. Evelyn held her breath, waiting for the terms. Colt Landry must plead guilty to his crimes, Blackwood said. He must accept responsibility for his actions. Evelyn nodded, her heart sinking slightly. It was what she had expected, but it still felt like a defeat. But, Blackwood continued, I will suspend his sentence. I will place him on probation, under your supervision, Sheriff Carter. Evelyn's eyes widened in surprise. It was more than she had hoped for, a chance for Colt to avoid prison, to start a new life. He must remain in redemption, Blackwood added. He must stay out of trouble. He must prove himself worthy of this second chance. He will, Evelyn said, her voice filled with gratitude. I promise you, he will. Blackwood nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. I believe you, Sheriff, he said. I believe you both. The price of redemption's path was high. A guilty plea, a suspended sentence, a life lived under the watchful eye of the law. But it was a price Colt was willing to pay, a price Evelyn was willing to help him bear. They had a chance, a fragile, uncertain chance, but a chance nonetheless. And as Evelyn left Blackwood's chambers, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and hope. She knew that the journey ahead would be long and arduous, but it would be a journey they would take together. Chapter 12. A Dance with Danger and Desire. The news of Colt's suspended sentence spread through redemption like wildfire, met with a mixture of relief, surprise, and cautious optimism. The townsfolk, who had witnessed Colt's bravery during the fire and his subsequent efforts to rebuild, were largely supportive, willing to give him a second chance. But there were also those who remained skeptical, who saw him as an outlaw, a threat, a reminder of the town's troubled past. Colt, for his part, was determined to prove himself worthy of the trust that Evelyn and Judge Blackwood had placed in him. He worked tirelessly, helping to rebuild homes and businesses, offering his skills and his labor wherever they were needed. He kept a low profile, avoiding any hint of trouble, determined to stay on the right side of the law. But the shadow of Silas Thorne still hung over redemption. The cattle baron, recovering from his gunshot wound, was seething with anger, plotting his revenge. He had lost the battle, but he was far from defeated. He was determined to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his, the water, the land, the town. He began to exert his influence, using his wealth and his connections to pressure local businesses, to intimidate ranchers, to create an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. He was biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike, to reclaim redemption and crush those who had defied him. Evelyn was aware of Thorne's machinations. She received reports of his activities, of his growing influence, of the threats he was making. She knew he was a dangerous man, a formidable opponent. But she was determined to protect her town, to protect Colt, to protect the fragile peace they had achieved. One evening, as Evelyn and Colt were walking home from the saloon, where they had shared a quiet meal, they were ambushed by a group of Thorne's men. It was a sudden, violent attack, a reminder of the danger that still lurked in the shadows. Gunfire erupted, bullets whizzing past their heads, shattering the quiet of the night. Evelyn and Colt dove for cover, taking refuge behind a water trough. They returned fire, their movements synchronized, a deadly dance of danger and desire. They fought back to back, protecting each other, their instincts honed by years of experience, by a shared understanding of the violence that permeated their world. They were outnumbered, but they were determined, fighting for their lives, for their future. Evelyn took down one of Thorne's men, her shot precise and deadly. Colt, with his own gun, dispatched another, his movements swift and efficient. They fought with a ferocity born of desperation, of a love that was being tested, threatened. The remaining gunmen, realizing they were outmatched, retreated, disappearing into the darkness. Evelyn and Colt were left standing, their hearts pounding, their bodies trembling from the adrenaline rush. They looked at each other, their eyes meeting in the dim light, a silent acknowledgement of the danger they had faced, the bond they shared. They were both breathing heavily, their clothes torn, their faces smudged with dirt and gunpowder. Colt reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Evelyn nodded, her voice hoarse. "I am," she said. "Thanks to you." He smiled, a tender smile that belied the violence they had just experienced. "We make a pretty good team, Sheriff," he said. "We do," she agreed, her voice softening. They stood there, for a moment, lost in each other's eyes, the danger they had faced momentarily forgotten. The desire that had been simmering beneath the surface, the love that had been rekindled, flared up, intense and undeniable. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative kiss at first, then deepening, becoming more passionate, more desperate. It was a kiss of survival, a kiss of gratitude, a kiss of love. And as they held each other, amidst the echoes of gunfire, amidst the threat of Thorne's return, they knew that their dance with danger and desire was far from over. But they also knew that they would face it together, their love a shield against the darkness, their bond a weapon against their enemies. The dance was dangerous, but the music, the rhythm of their hearts, was too compelling to resist. Chapter 13. Secrets Buried Beneath the Sand. The attempted ambush served as a stark reminder of the precariousness of their situation. Evelyn knew that Thorne wouldn't give up, that he would continue to test them, to probe their defenses, to look for weaknesses. She had to be vigilant, had to be prepared for anything. She increased patrols, strengthened security around the town, and began to investigate Thorne's activities more closely. She discovered that he was buying up land around Redemption, consolidating his holdings, preparing for a larger-scale assault. He was also recruiting more men, mercenaries and gunslingers, building an army to enforce his will. Evelyn realized that she needed help, that she couldn't face Thorne alone. She sent messages to neighboring towns, to the territorial governor, requesting assistance, but the responses were slow and unpromising. It seemed that Redemption was on its own, isolated and vulnerable. One day, while riding out to inspect the perimeter of the town, Evelyn stumbled upon an old, abandoned mine shaft, hidden amongst the rocks and scrub brush. It was a relic of Redemption's past, a reminder of the days when the town had been a bustling mining center, before the silver had run out and the miners had moved on. Curiosity piqued. She dismounted and approached the mine shaft cautiously. The entrance was partially collapsed, covered in debris and overgrown with weeds. But she could see that the shaft extended deep into the earth, a dark and mysterious tunnel leading into the unknown. She had a feeling, an intuition, that this mine held a secret, something that could help her in her fight against Thorne. She decided to explore it, despite the potential dangers. She returned to town, gathering supplies, a lantern, rope, and her trusty Colt peacemaker. She told Colt of her discovery, her suspicion that the mine might hold a clue, a weapon, something that could give them an advantage. Colt, initially hesitant, agreed to accompany her. He knew the risks, the dangers of exploring an abandoned mine, but he also trusted Evelyn's instincts, her intuition. He knew that she wouldn't take such a risk without a good reason. Together, they returned to the mine shaft, their hearts pounding with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. They cleared away the debris, secured the rope, and descended into the darkness, the lantern casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The air inside the mine was cool and damp, heavy with the smell of dust and decay. They moved slowly, cautiously, their senses on high alert. They encountered bats, spiders, and other creatures of the darkness, but they pressed on, determined to uncover the mine's secrets. As they delved deeper, they discovered a series of tunnels and chambers, remnants of the mining operations that had once taken place here. They found old tools, discarded equipment, and something else. In a large, central chamber, they found a cache of weapons, rifles, pistols, ammunition hidden away and forgotten. It was a significant find, a potential arsenal that could arm the townsfolk, give them a fighting chance against Thorne's mercenaries. But that wasn't all. In a smaller, side chamber, they found a strongbox, locked and secured. Colt, using his skills as a former outlaw, managed to pick the lock, revealing the contents within. Inside the strongbox, they found documents, papers, deeds, and a map. It was a map of the area, showing the location of water sources, including the vast underground aquifer that Thorne was so desperate to control. But the map also showed something else, a network of tunnels, secret passages, that connected the mine to various points in and around Redemption, including Thorne's ranch. The mine wasn't just a mine. It was a secret weapon, a strategic advantage, a way to infiltrate Thorne's stronghold, to disrupt his plans, to strike at him from the shadows. Evelyn and Colt looked at each other, their eyes widening in realization. They had stumbled upon something far more significant than they had imagined. They had uncovered secrets buried beneath the sand, secrets that could change the course of their fight against Thorne, secrets that could determine the fate of Redemption. The past, it seemed, was not quite finished with them. It had offered them a weapon, a chance, a dangerous, but potentially decisive advantage. Chapter 14. The Reckoning of Broken Oaths. The discovery of the map and the weapons cache changed everything. Evelyn and Colt now had a strategic advantage, a way to fight Thorne on their own terms, to disrupt his plans and potentially defeat him. But they also knew that using the mine was a risky proposition, that it could easily backfire, leading to disaster. They spent days studying the map, memorizing the network of tunnels, planning their strategy. They decided to keep the discovery a secret, sharing it only with a handful of trusted deputies, men they knew they could rely on. They needed to maintain the element of surprise, to use the mine to their advantage without alerting Thorne to their plans. Evelyn also began to prepare the townsfolk for a potential confrontation. She organized training sessions, teaching them how to use the newly discovered weapons, how to defend themselves. She instilled in them a sense of unity, of purpose, of determination to fight for their homes, their lives, their freedom. Colt, meanwhile, took on the responsibility of exploring the tunnels, mapping out the safest routes, identifying potential dangers. He used his skills as a former outlaw, his knowledge of stealth and infiltration, to navigate the dark and treacherous passages. He discovered that some of the tunnels were unstable, partially collapsed, requiring careful navigation. He also found evidence of recent activity, suggesting that Thorne's men might be aware of the mine's existence, perhaps even using it for their own purposes. One evening, while exploring a tunnel that led towards Thorne's ranch, Colt stumbled upon a group of Thorne's men, meeting in a secret chamber. He overheard their conversation, their plans to launch a full-scale attack on Redemption, to seize the town by force and eliminate anyone who stood in their way. Colt realized that time was running out. Thorne was preparing to strike, and Redemption was in imminent danger. He raced back to Evelyn, relaying the information, the urgency of the situation. Evelyn knew they had to act quickly. They couldn't wait for Thorne to attack. They had to strike first, using the mine to their advantage, to disrupt his plans and preempt his assault. They decided to launch a two-pronged attack. A small group, led by Colt, would infiltrate Thorne's ranch through the tunnels, aiming to disable his operations, to capture or kill him, to end his threat once and for all. The rest of the townsfolk, led by Evelyn, would defend Redemption, preparing for Thorne's inevitable retaliation. It was a daring, dangerous plan, a desperate gamble. But they had no other choice. They were fighting for their survival, for their future, for the soul of Redemption. As the sun began to set, casting long, ominous shadows across the desert landscape, Colt and his team entered the mine, disappearing into the darkness, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. Evelyn, meanwhile, rallied her forces, preparing for the battle that was about to begin. The reckoning of broken oaths was at hand. The past, the present, and the future were colliding, the fate of redemption hanging in the balance. Evelyn and Colt, bound by love, by loyalty, by a shared sense of justice, were facing their greatest challenge, their ultimate test. The tunnels were dark, the future uncertain, but their resolve was unshakable. Chapter 15. Where Loyalty and Love Collide. Colt and his small team moved stealthily through the dark, twisting tunnels, the only sound their own breathing and the occasional scuttling of unseen creatures. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, the weight of the world pressing down on them. They followed the map, Colt's instincts guiding them, his experience as an outlaw proving invaluable. They encountered obstacles, collapsed passages, treacherous drops, but they overcame them, their determination unwavering. They were a team, bound by a shared purpose, a loyalty to Evelyn and to redemption. As they neared Thorne's ranch, they could hear the sounds of activity above them, voices, the clatter of horses, the preparations for the attack. They knew they were close, that the moment of confrontation was at hand. They emerged from the tunnel in a hidden cellar beneath Thorne's ranch house, a secret entrance known only to a few. They moved silently through the house, their weapons drawn, their senses on high alert. They found Thorne in his study, poring over maps, planning his assault on redemption. He was surrounded by his lieutenants, hardened criminals, ruthless men loyal only to him. Colt and his team burst into the room, guns blazing, taking Thorne and his men by surprise. A fierce firefight erupted, the sound of gunfire echoing through the house, shattering the quiet of the night. Colt fought with a cold, calculated fury, his movements precise and deadly. He was fighting for Evelyn, for redemption, for his own redemption. He took down several of Thorne's men, his aim unerring, his resolve unshakable. But Thorne's men were numerous and well-armed. Colt's team suffered casualties, one man falling dead, another wounded. Colt himself was grazed by a bullet, a searing pain shooting through his arm. He pressed on, undeterred, his focus on Thorne. He saw the cattle baron, his face contorted with rage and hatred, attempting to escape through a back door. Colt pursued him, tackling him to the ground, a brutal struggle ensuing. They grappled, punches thrown, knives flashing, a desperate fight for survival. Meanwhile, in redemption, Evelyn and her forces were preparing for Thorne's attack. They had barricaded the streets, positioned snipers on rooftops, armed every able-bodied citizen. They were ready, determined to defend their town, to fight for their freedom. As the first wave of Thorne's men rode into town, they were met with a hail of gunfire, a fierce resistance that took them by surprise. The townsfolk, inspired by Evelyn's leadership, fought with courage and determination, defending their homes, their families, their lives. Evelyn, at the forefront of the battle, directed her forces, her voice ringing out above the din of gunfire. She was a leader, a warrior, a sheriff protecting her town. The battle raged, a brutal and bloody conflict, the fate of redemption hanging in the balance. The streets ran red with blood, the air filled with the smell of gunpowder and death. Back at Thorne's ranch, Colt finally managed to subdue Thorne, disarming him, pinning him to the ground. He had him at his mercy, his gun pointed at his head. He could kill him, end his threat once and for all. It would be justice, revenge, a solution to their problems. But as he looked into Thorne's eyes, he saw not just hatred and anger, but also fear. He saw a broken man, a man consumed by greed and ambition, a man who had lost everything. And in that moment, Colt made a choice. He lowered his gun. He couldn't kill him. Not in cold blood. It wasn't the man he wanted to be. It wasn't the life he wanted to lead. "It's over, Thorne," he said, his voice hoarse. "You're finished." He tied Thorne up, leaving him for the authorities to find. He had won. But the victory felt hollow, tinged with sadness, with the weight of the violence he had witnessed, the lives that had been lost. Where loyalty and love collided, he had chosen a path of restraint, a path that mirrored Evelyn's heart. He hoped it was enough. Chapter 16. A storm brewing on the horizon. With Thorn captured and his men scattered or subdued, both at the ranch and in Redemption, a fragile peace descended. The townsfolk, weary but victorious, began the arduous task of tending to the wounded, burying the dead, and rebuilding their shattered town. The immediate threat was over, but the scars, both physical and emotional, remained. Evelyn, exhausted but resolute, oversaw the aftermath, ensuring that justice was served, that order was restored. She made arrangements for Thorn to be transported to the territorial prison, where he would face trial for his crimes. She also sent word to the governor, informing him of the events, of Colt's role in capturing Thorn, of the victory they had achieved. Colt, his arm bandaged, his body aching, returned to Redemption a changed man. He had faced his demons, his past, and he had chosen a different path. He had chosen mercy over vengeance, redemption over retribution. He had proven himself worthy of Evelyn's love, of her trust. But even as they celebrated their victory, a sense of unease lingered. They knew that Thorn's capture was not the end of their troubles. He had powerful allies, connections that reached far beyond Redemption. There were others who would seek to exploit the situation, to seize control of the water, the land, the resources that Thorn had coveted. One evening, as Evelyn and Colt were sitting on the porch of her ranch house, watching the sun set over the vast, desolate landscape, a rider approached, a cloud of dust billowing behind him. It was Deputy Miller, his face grim, his eyes filled with alarm. "Sheriff," he said, his voice breathless, "we have a problem. A big problem." Evelyn and Colt exchanged a look, their hearts sinking. They knew what was coming. "What is it, Miller?" Evelyn asked, her voice steady, despite the tremor of fear that ran through her. "A telegram," Miller said, handing her a crumpled piece of paper. "From the governor." Evelyn unfolded the telegram, her eyes scanning the words, her face paling with each line. Colt stood beside her, reading over her shoulder, his own expression hardening. The telegram was brief and to the point. The governor, influenced by Thorn's allies, had ordered Colt's immediate arrest. He was to be taken into custody and transported to the territorial prison, where he would face trial for his past crimes. The governor had disregarded Evelyn's report, dismissed Colt's role in capturing Thorn, and branded him a dangerous outlaw who needed to be brought to justice. Evelyn and Colt looked at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and despair. They had fought so hard, risked so much, and yet it seemed that it was all for naught. The law, it seemed, was not interested in redemption, in second chances. "What are we going to do?" Miller asked, his voice trembling. Evelyn crumpled the telegram in her hand, her jaw tightening, her eyes blazing with defiance. "We're not going to let them take him," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "We're not going to let them win." Colt nodded, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "I'm not going back to prison, Evie," he said. "Not for Thorn. Not for anyone." A storm was brewing on the horizon, a storm of injustice, of corruption, of powerful forces arrayed against them. But Evelyn and Colt were ready. They had faced storms before, and they had survived. They would face this one together, their love a shield, their loyalty a weapon, their determination unshakable. The telegram was a declaration of war, and they were ready to fight. Chapter 17. The Heart's Uncharted Territory. Evelyn's decision to defy the governor's order was a bold, dangerous move, one that could cost her everything. She was putting her career, her reputation, her freedom on the line for Colt, for the man she loved, for the belief in his redemption. She knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed allies, support, a plan. She gathered her most trusted deputies, the men who had fought alongside her during the attack on Redemption, the men who believed in Colt, in his transformation. She explained the situation, the governor's order, her decision to defy it. She asked for their loyalty, their support, their willingness to risk everything for what they believed in. They didn't hesitate. They stood with her, united in their determination to protect Colt, to fight for justice, to defy the corruption that was threatening to engulf them. They began to prepare, gathering supplies, fortifying the town, making plans for a potential siege. They knew that the governor would send marshals, soldiers, to enforce his order. They had to be ready to defend themselves, to protect Colt, to fight for their freedom. Evelyn also sent messages to neighboring towns, to ranchers and farmers who had benefited from Colt's actions, who believed in his redemption. She asked for their help, their support, their willingness to stand with redemption against the forces of injustice. The response was slow, uncertain. Many were afraid, unwilling to risk the wrath of the governor, to challenge the established order. But there were also those who were willing to fight, who believed in justice, in second chances, in the power of love and loyalty. Meanwhile, Colt was struggling with his own conscience. He knew that Evelyn was risking everything for him, that she was putting herself in danger, that she was defying the law on his behalf. He felt a surge of guilt, of responsibility, of a desire to protect her, even if it meant sacrificing himself. He considered leaving, disappearing into the wilderness, drawing the attention away from redemption, from Evelyn. But he knew that she wouldn't let him, that she would follow him, that she would never give up on him. One evening, as they were sitting together in her office, the weight of their situation pressing down on them, Colt voiced his doubts, his fears. "Maybe I should just turn myself in, Evie," he said, his voice low and somber. "Maybe it would be better for you, for everyone, if I just faced the consequences." Evelyn looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and anger. "Don't you dare say that," she said, her voice firm. "Don't you dare even think it." "But I'm causing you so much trouble," he insisted. "I'm putting you in danger." "I'm not afraid," she said. "I'm not backing down. I believe in you, Colt. I believe in us." She reached out, her hand gently touching his face. "We're in this together," she said softly. "And we're going to fight this together. We're going to win." Her words, her touch, rekindled his hope, his determination. He saw the love in her eyes, the unwavering belief in him, the willingness to fight for their future. He knew he couldn't let her down, not now, not ever. They were entering uncharted territory, a realm where the law had no meaning, where love and loyalty were the only guiding principles. They were navigating by their hearts, their instincts, their shared belief in a better future. The path ahead was dangerous, uncertain, but they were ready to face it, together. They had ventured into a place beyond maps, beyond rules, a place defined only by the strength of their bond. Chapter 18. Facing the demons of the past. The news of Evelyn's defiance spread quickly, reaching the ears of the governor, of Thorne's allies, of everyone who had a stake in the fate of redemption. The governor, enraged by her insubordination, ordered a detachment of federal marshals, led by a ruthless and ambitious man named Captain Rourke, to apprehend Colt and bring Evelyn to justice. Rourke was a formidable opponent, a man known for his brutality, his unwavering loyalty to the governor, his determination to crush any opposition. He arrived in Redemption with a contingent of heavily armed marshals, their presence casting a shadow of fear and intimidation over the town. Evelyn and Colt, along with their loyal deputies and a growing number of supporters from neighboring towns and ranches, prepared for the confrontation. They fortified the town, barricading the streets, positioning snipers on rooftops, preparing for a siege. They knew that they were outnumbered, outgunned, that the odds were stacked against them. But they were determined to fight, to defend their town, to protect Colt, to stand up for what they believed in. Before the marshals arrived, Evelyn did something unexpected. She sent for the circuit judge, Silas Blackwood. It was time for things to get official. Judge Blackwood arrived, concerned and surprised, but also understanding. He had a soft spot for Evelyn. "Evelyn, what have you done?" he asked. "I need a trial, Judge. Here.
Now."
For Colt. A fair trial. The judge was hesitant. "Evelyn, that's impossible." The governor be damned," she spat, cutting him off. "This is my town and Colt saved it. He deserves a real trial, not some kangaroo court in the territorial capital." Blackwood, seeing the fire in Evelyn's eyes and knowing in his heart that she was right, finally relented. He was a romantic at heart, and an outlaw of sorts himself. "All right, Evelyn. I'll do it. But this is highly irregular. If the governor finds out, let him find out," Evelyn said with a defiant smile. "Let him see what justice really looks like." The trial was held in the town square, under the watchful eyes of the townsfolk, the marshals, and Captain Rourke. It was a tense, dramatic scene, a showdown between the law and the heart, between justice and corruption. Evelyn acted as Colt's defender, presenting the evidence of his actions in stopping Thorne, of his efforts to redeem himself, of the support he had from the community. She called witnesses, townsfolk who testified to Colt's character, to his bravery, to his transformation. Rourke, acting as prosecutor, presented the evidence of Colt's past crimes, his outlaw status, the governor's order for his arrest. He painted Colt as a dangerous criminal, a threat to society, a man who deserved to be punished. The trial was a battle of wills, a clash of ideologies, a test of Evelyn's courage and Colt's redemption. The townsfolk watched, their hearts pounding, their hopes and fears hanging in the balance. As the trial reached its climax, Colt took the stand, facing his demons, his past, his mistakes. He spoke honestly, openly about his life, his regrets, his desire for a second chance. "I know I've done wrong," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I know I've broken the law, but I'm not the same man I was. I've changed. I've found something worth fighting for, something worth living for." He looked at Evelyn, his eyes filled with love and gratitude.
"I found her," he said.
"And she showed me that redemption is possible, that even an outlaw can find a way back to the light." His words, his sincerity, touched the hearts of everyone present, even Rourke, even the hardened marshals. The demons of the past were being faced, not with guns, but with truth, with vulnerability, with the power of love. The courtroom, the town square, was silent, waiting for the verdict, a verdict that would determine not only Colt's fate, but the fate of redemption itself. Chapter 19. A Showdown Under the Desert Moon. Judge Blackwood, after hearing all the evidence, the testimonies, Colt's heartfelt confession, retired to his makeshift chambers in the back of the saloon. The tension in the town square was palpable, a thick blanket of anticipation and anxiety. The townsfolk, the marshals, Evelyn, and Colt, all waited, their fates hanging in the balance. Rourke, confident in his position, paced impatiently, his hand never far from his gun. He believed in the law, in order, in the authority of the governor. He saw Colt as a criminal, Evelyn as a traitor, and redemption as a town that needed to be brought to heel. Evelyn stood beside Colt, her hand in his, their fingers intertwined. They didn't speak, their eyes communicating a silent message of love, of support, of unwavering belief in each other. They had faced so much together, overcome so many obstacles, and they were ready to face this final challenge, whatever the outcome. After what seemed like an eternity, Judge Blackwood emerged, his face somber, his eyes filled with a mixture of gravity and something else. Something that looked like hope. He took his seat at the makeshift bench, the silence in the town square absolute. He looked at Colt, then at Evelyn, then at the assembled crowd. "In the matter of the territory versus Colt Landry," he began, his voice ringing out across the square, "I have reached a verdict." He paused, drawing a deep breath, the tension reaching a breaking point. On the charges of bank robbery, assault, and aiding and abetting known criminals, he continued, "I find the defendant guilty." A collective gasp went through the crowd, a wave of despair washing over Evelyn, over Colt, over the townsfolk. It seemed that their hopes had been dashed, that the law had prevailed, that redemption was not to be. But Blackwood wasn't finished. "However," he said, his voice rising in volume, "in light of the extenuating circumstances, in light of the defendant's actions in saving the town of redemption from Silas Thorne, in light of the overwhelming evidence of his remorse and his efforts to reform, I hereby suspend the sentence." A stunned silence followed, then a roar of disbelief, of joy, of relief. The townsfolk erupted in cheers, their faces beaming, their hearts overflowing with gratitude. Evelyn and Colt embraced, their tears flowing freely, their bodies trembling with emotion. They had won. They had defied the odds, overcome the obstacles, and found a way to a new beginning. But Rourke was not about to accept this verdict. He stepped forward, his face contorted with rage, his hand reaching for his gun. "This is an outrage," he shouted. "I will not stand for this. I have my orders." He drew his gun, aiming at Colt, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, Evelyn stepped in front of Colt, shielding him with her body, her own gun drawn and aimed at Rourke. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice cold and steady, her eyes blazing with defiance. "You touch him, and you'll have to go through me." It was a showdown, a classic Western standoff, under the desert moon, the law versus love, justice versus corruption. The air crackled with tension, with the potential for violence, with the fate of redemption hanging in the balance. Rourke hesitated, his eyes flickering between Evelyn and Colt, his hand trembling on his gun. He saw the determination in Evelyn's eyes, the unwavering love that bound her to Colt, the support of the townsfolk behind them. He knew he was outmatched, not by guns, but by something far stronger, something far more powerful. He was outmatched by the spirit of redemption, by the belief in second chances, by the power of love. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his gun. He had lost. His law had been defeated. "This isn't over," he snarled, his voice filled with bitterness. "I'll be back. Then we'll be ready," Evelyn said, her voice unwavering. Rourke turned and stalked away, his marshals following him, their heads hung in defeat. The showdown was over. Redemption had won. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, a new day dawned for redemption, a day of hope, of freedom, of second chances. Evelyn and Colt stood together, their arms wrapped around each other, their hearts filled with love and gratitude. They had faced the darkness, and they had emerged victorious. The showdown was over, but their journey, their life together, was just beginning. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The departure of Rourke and his marshals marked a turning point for redemption. The town, emboldened by their victory, by Evelyn's defiance, by Colt's redemption, began to rebuild, not just their homes and businesses, but their spirit, their sense of community. The threat of Thorne and the governor's corruption still lingered, but it no longer held the same power, the same fear. Evelyn and Colt, now free to pursue their life together, focused on building a future, on creating a home, on solidifying their bond. They worked side by side, rebuilding the ranch, tending to the animals, sharing their hopes and dreams. But the outside world, the world of politics and power, continued to intrude. The governor, humiliated by Rourke's defeat, by Evelyn's defiance, was not about to let redemption go unpunished. He began to use his influence to undermine the town, to cut off supplies, to make life difficult for the residents. Evelyn, however, was not one to back down from a fight. She rallied the townsfolk, organized resistance, and sought help from outside sources. She contacted journalists, exposing the governor's corruption, his abuse of power. She reached out to other territorial officials, to anyone who would listen, who believed in justice, in fairness. Her efforts began to bear fruit. The story of redemption, of the outlaw turned hero, of the sheriff who defied the governor, of the town that stood up for what was right, began to spread. Public opinion began to turn against the governor, in favor of redemption. The governor, realizing that he was losing control, decided to make one final, desperate move. He orchestrated a scheme to frame Colt for a new crime, a fabricated robbery, hoping to discredit him, to justify his arrest, to silence Evelyn and redemption once and for all. He sent a new team of marshals, disguised as outlaws, to stage the robbery, to plant evidence implicating Colt. But Evelyn, anticipating his move, was ready. She had her deputies watching, waiting, prepared to intercept the fake outlaws, to expose the governor's plot. A final confrontation ensued, not a gunfight, but a battle of wits, of evidence, of public opinion. Evelyn, with the help of Judge Blackwood, who had become a staunch ally, exposed the governor's scheme, presenting irrefutable proof of his corruption, his abuse of power. The fake outlaws were arrested, their testimony revealing the governor's involvement. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. The governor's plot was foiled, his reputation ruined, his career destroyed. The final confrontation was not of guns and bullets, but of truth and justice. Evelyn and Colt, working together, had defeated not just a corrupt governor, but a system of corruption, a culture of fear and intimidation. With the governor's threat neutralized, redemption was finally free to pursue its own destiny, free to build a future based on justice, on fairness, on the principles of community and cooperation. Evelyn and Colt, their names cleared, their love solidified, their future secure, stood together on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sun set over the vast, open horizon. They had faced their final confrontation, a confrontation of hearts and horizons, and they had emerged victorious. They had found their redemption, not just as individuals, but as a couple, as a community. They had built a life together, a life based on love, on trust, on a shared belief in a better future. The final confrontation was over, and their new life, a life of peace, of prosperity, of happiness, was just beginning. Their intertwined future stretched before them, as vast and promising as the Arizona sky. Epilogue. Years passed. Redemption flourished, growing from a dusty frontier town into a thriving community, a testament to the courage and resilience of its people, to the leadership of Evelyn Carter, to the redemption of Colt Landry. Evelyn and Colt remained at the heart of the town, their ranch a symbol of hope, of second chances, of the power of love to overcome adversity. They raised a family, children and grandchildren who grew up hearing the stories of their parents' and grandparents' bravery, of their fight for justice, of their unwavering love. Evelyn eventually retired as sheriff, passing the badge on to her eldest son, who carried on her legacy of integrity, of courage, of dedication to the law. She remained a respected figure in the community, a wise elder, a source of guidance and inspiration. Colt, his outlaw past long behind him, became a respected rancher, a community leader, a man known for his honesty, his generosity, his unwavering commitment to redemption. He never forgot his past, the mistakes he had made, the lessons he had learned. He used his experiences to guide others, to help young people avoid the pitfalls of his youth, to show them that redemption was always possible. They lived a long and happy life together, their love enduring, their bond unbreakable. They faced challenges, of course, the inevitable trials and tribulations of life, but they faced them together, their love a constant source of strength, of comfort, of support. One evening, as they sat on their porch, watching the sun set over the vast, open horizon, a familiar scene that had played out countless times over the years, Evelyn reached for Colt's hand, her fingers intertwining with his, a gesture of love, of companionship, of a lifetime shared. "We did it, Colt," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "We built a life together. We built a home." He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his gaze meeting hers. "We did, Evie," he said. "And I wouldn't trade it for anything." They sat in silence, their hands clasped together, their hearts filled with gratitude, with peace, with a love that had endured the test of time, the challenges of the frontier, the storms of life. As the last rays of the sun faded, leaving the sky ablaze with stars, Evelyn leaned her head against Colt's shoulder, a sense of contentment, of fulfillment, washing over her. They had found their redemption, their happiness, their forever, in the heart of the Arizona desert, in the town of redemption, in each other's arms. Their story, a story of love, of courage, of second chances, was complete. The vast expanse above mirrored the boundless love they shared, a love that had conquered all.